Welcome to this special game analysis for WCL members. I received numerous games from the members, games being played online on WCL as well as on over-the-board tournament. I chose an interesting game that was played recently at the Super Nationals in Nashville by one of the young players. And I'll read some of his comments to the game and his observations of the game itself. The WCL member had the black pieces and his opponent was white. This is how the game started. Very standard opening moves, and black chose the Queen's Indian defense. And here white responded with a bit strange looking move, unless you're an opening expert, a variation that was greatly favored by Petrosyan and then in later years by Garry Kasparov. The move intends to prevent the black bishop appearing on b4. And here is the first move that I think is a little premature, that I don't really like here for black, by black playing c5. I'd much rather see black playing bishop b7 first. The rule of thumb is when you play b6, 99% of the time you want to follow up with bishop b7. The same goes for fianchettoing a bishop in any of the other pockets of the board, whether g3 and bishop g2 or g6, bishop g7, and so on. So let's see why the immediate c5 is not the greatest choice. Well, it allows white to push through with the pawn to d5. And this gives white some space advantage in the center. Of course, this is largely a Benoni defense type of position where black would trade the pawns and play d6 and then usually develop the bishop to g7 after playing g6. I have to say though that the b6 and bishop b7 development usually does not go very well hand in hand with the Benoni defense type of positions. In our game, black chose to play differently and played d6 right away in this position. Trading pawns on e6 is not necessarily a good thing for white, because after that trade, typically black would capture back with the pawn and then try to play d5 and develop quite a strong center. So white is in no rush in doing that trade at all. White continued with knight c3 and black with bishop e7 and e4. White is playing in a very standard way in gaining space, developing his pieces, and at the same time restricting black's activity as much as possible. And this was one of the critical moments of the game where black chose to close the center by pushing the pawn to e5. Well, it's a very questionable decision because while it avoids immediate tragedy in the opening because keeps the position very closed, it also gives white a clear space advantage and more room to maneuver. I think I would probably prefer to trade the pawns on d5 rather. What black needs to be careful about in similar situations, that for example after castle, white may have ideas such as trading the pawns and then playing e5, creating black isolated pawns on the e file. Of course, the one on e5 can be recaptured, for example, after the trade of the queens. So I guess that is why black chose to do something with that e6 pawn and not just keep it there, leaving white the option at his choice to take on e6. So after this e5 move, the character of the game has been defined. It's a very closed type of position, and we're ahead of a lot of maneuvering. I do like white's next move, which was playing h3, preventing the black bishop from getting to g4 and creating a pin over white's knight. And here I don't like black's next move. Black played bishop to d7. That's certainly an awkward place for the bishop in this moment. I think black should have just castled, following the general principle. And white continued by playing bishop e2. And black played knight a6, which is certainly a logical move. After the bishop went to d7, taking away that square from the knight, the only logical place for that knight is on c7, and that's where the knight is aiming to go. White castled, and black played knight c7. Black is hoping one day, perhaps, to play b5. Certainly his pieces are positioned to aid that goal. And white continued with developing the bishop to e3, and black finally castled. So we kind of finished the opening stage of this game, as all the pieces, minor pieces, have been developed, and both sides have castled. This is the stage where each side needs to step back for a moment and think, what should be the plan? Where are we going? Well, from white's perspective, a typical idea would be trying to play b4 at one moment to gain more space advantage and to be ready to open the b file at the right moment. Another option is to try to prepare to open the position with f4. A typical plan to accomplish that is to retreat the knight to e1 with the idea to then reposition it on d3 and then play f4 at the right moment. In the meantime, white played not a bad move, played queen c2, connecting the two rooks. And black played a6, trying to prepare b5. The problem with this move is that black will not really get to play b5 anyway, because it's white's turn now, and white will play b4, putting pressure on the c5 pawn, keeping black's b6 pawn busy to guard that pawn. At the same time, because of black's last move by playing a6, it weakened potentially the b6 square. So imagine in the future when these pawns eventually on b4 and b6 will be traded off on c5, and white will look for entrance point on the b file. In addition to b7, now the b6 square also will be an entrance point for the white knight or rook in the future. At the same time, the pawn on a6 has no benefit at all. Black here played retreating the knight from f6 to e8 with the idea to prepare the f7 pawn's advancement to f5. It's pretty much the only active plan that black has left in the position. And white repositioned his bishop by playing bishop to d3, preventing black's plan of f5. And black played g6. Black still is hoping to play f5 after perhaps positioning the knight on g7. And here I did not like what white did. White played g4 trying to desperately prevent that move. It's true in such and similar positions, it's often seen that white would play g4 to do that, even though it's weakening his own king side. The reason why this is acceptable is because the center of the board is so closed and the black pieces are so far away from getting near the white king. Nevertheless, in this case, I think there was no need for taking such risk. I personally would have preferred moving my bishop to h6, forcing the knight into the pin, and then I think at the moment focus on the queen side and try to enter on those key squares which I mentioned earlier, b6 or b7, on the queen side. Let's continue in what happened with the game after white played g4. I think here black should have immediately taken advantage of the opportunity to play h5 with the idea that if pawn takes pawn, the black bishop could capture on h3. Black missed this opportunity and played instead stubbornly for the same plan, queen c8, further preparing f5. The problem with that is that even when black would get to play f5, it's not really such a great achievement. Here white played an interesting move by moving the knight to h2, which prepares the advancement of white's f-pawn. For example, now, if black would still insist on playing f5, white could do general trades on f5, maybe also insert a trade of the pawns on the queen side, and then continue with the trades on f5 and just trade everything off and reach such a queenless middle game. What we would be left with is bishops of the same color, which clearly favors white, as these pawns are on dark squares, they are blocked, and therefore they are a potential target of the white bishop, while they greatly restrict the black bishop on e7. Also, the white knight would get a nice square on e4 to pressure the pawn on d6 and blockade black's e5 pawn. It would be a clearly favorable position strategically for white. Going back to the position of the game after knight h2, black continued with knight g7. So far, both sides are playing quite logically and following their own plans. And white here certainly made the right choice by playing f4. Even though the white king has also castled on this side, but yet in this particular position it's safe to open up the position because of white's space advantage, and at the same time the center is still rather closed even after the trade of this pair of pawns. The black pieces have real hard time to get activated. Of course, it would be an error for black to play passively, for example, and play bishop f6, because then white would advance all his pawns and gain even more space and more advantage. So in the game, black responded correctly by capturing the pawn on f4, and the bishop recaptured on f4. And here, black, I guess, didn't want to sit and wait and played h5, which of course is a risky move to open up in front of your own king, although it's probably the only chance to get activity. Here, objectively, I think it was better for white to trade on c5 and right away play e5 and create that protected passed pawn on d5 that would give white a significant advantage. Also, in this position, white would be ready to aim to sacrifice his bishop on g6 to destroy all the defensive pawns in front of the black king. In the game, white continued by playing queen g2, which is not a bad move either, although may not be as ambitious as the variation I just demonstrated. As we can see, black is in a rather passive position, and it's white who dictates the speed of the game. Here again, white could play e5, not a bad choice, and neither was white's doubling the rooks along the f-file. Finally, the black bishop got to an active position, being the only active piece in black's position. Attacking the white knight on c3, that had to be protected, and finally the bishop gave a check and centralized itself on d4. White taking h1, and black traded pawns on b4, followed by playing a5. Again, as we can see, black is desperately wanting to have activity and counterplay, which is probably, practically speaking, the best choice. And the knight retreated to e2, attacking the bishop. Bishop went to b2, and the bishop got attacked again. And here, white played b5, making sure that part of the board remains closed. Bishop went back to c5, quite a nice place for the bishop, and now at least black has a passed pawn that may become dangerous. Therefore, white needs to play aggressively. I think the best choice here for white was to play bishop to h6, and then, for example, if king h7, then white is ready to convert the positional advantage to material advantage, because after king takes h6, the combination with rook f7 would be decisive because of the checkmate threat with queen g6. White instead chose to capture on h5, which is not bad either, and black recaptured with the knight. And here again, white has a nice position because the black king is in more danger than white, because the white queen and rooks have an easier access on that part of the board. And here, moving the bishop away, for example, to g5, threatening with bishop e7, making sure that bishop remains on the board, I think was perhaps a better choice. But I also don't mind the move that white chose, doubling up the rook on f1 in this position. If black would have traded the knight for the bishop, the problems wouldn't have gotten solved, because the sacrifice on g6 is unavoidable, and it's very strong for white. Black did not do the trade, but played an inferior move, played king h7, I guess trying to get out of the g-file. The best choice was instead to indeed advance the a-pawn. And now white moved the bishop to g5, opening the f-file, and now attacking the pawn on f7. Now black's position is hopeless with correct play on the white side. If here black would have responded with f6, the white knight would have came to the attack with knight g4, and black would be in serious trouble because, for example, if black defends that pawn with king g7, then bishop h6 comes. And again, let's go back, see what happened in the game. Black played knight eg7. At the moment, white could not capture yet on f7 because black would have captured in exchange on h3. and turning the table around. My top choice here would be bishop e7, attacking the rook, and then opening the diagonal of white's light squared bishop, and white's attack would be devastating. Although white's choice is not bad either, white played knight g4, bringing the knight into the game. And here black made a losing mistake by capturing that knight and trapping his own knight on h5. The only move to stay in the game and continue the fight was to play f5, although white would be still ahead even after that choice. After bishop g4, white, of course, captures back with the pawn, trapping the knight on h5. Continued, rook h8, white grabbed the knight, and then grabbed the pawn. You would think game over. However, not so fast. There was still a lot to happen in this game. In this position, the simplest win for white was to play bishop h4, opening the g file and the threat of the queen to the g6 pawn. Instead, white chose to play rook f8, which gives away the game. Now, black all of a sudden trades his queen for 2 rooks. And it's true, white also has an extra bishop, but because of the dangerous position of the white king, the discovery in the air, black is threatening to play knight f4 and win the white queen. It's actually white who has to be very, very careful not to lose immediately. White played bishop h4, closing up the h-file and at the same time threatened with queen takes pawn. And in this position, black made a sad mistake, a big blunder, by playing rook f1 check in hopes for a fork with knight g3. Unfortunately, he forgot that not only the bishop is controlling the gt square, which is pinned, but the knight is as well, and the knight can capture the knight, and now black's position, of course, is hopeless. So let's go back just a little bit to this position and see what black should have done to keep his advantage. Black should have retreated the knight to g7 and create a discovered attack on the white bishop on h4, which is pinned and cannot move away. And when white protects the bishop, the black bishop comes in to f2 using the pin. After knight g3, black would play bishop e3, threatening to use the pin again by g5. And white has no good way to get out of the pin because, for example, after king g2, the king would be forced right back into the pin after a check with rook f2. Well, to summarize the game, white had the advantage on the most part. White had a great strategical advantage, and he played a pretty good game, reaching a winning position. Once that happened, white made a big blunder by playing rook f8 and giving away the advantage. Luckily for white, black responded with an even bigger blunder on the last move of the game with rook f1. Black's game was rather passive all throughout and never really got sufficient activity and counterplay. The best chance black had in the game after he reached that passive closed position on move 28, pushing the pawn to a4. I appreciate you all sending me games for me to review, to choose from, and keep it coming. Every 2 weeks, I'll keep picking a game and going over it. Come and listen and learn from your or others' mistakes. Bye-bye.